I'm going to do an example called firing into the blue. This typically is utilized when there's multiple possible targets in front of this single firing unit. Very common when you got dealing with skirmishers against a whole line of different battalions. But also could be a case where you've got multiple battalions faced off by one battalion. Now in this example I had the Austrians move up and they're closing the range on this French Légère. Now when it comes to the mutual fire phase, both sides will fire. But in this example, the Austrians, when they fire, you got to figure out the 22.5 degrees to figure out how many figures can actually bear. And in this case, it looks like it's all but 2. So this battalion is going to fire with 7 figures. 7 figures, we're more than an inch here, so this is going to be a straight linear table shot. Normal 3 to 4 rank, 7 figures, linear is a 58%. So they would roll, and they rolled a 98, and they missed. Remember, this is an all or nothing principle. But if you get a percentage above 100%, you automatically are going to get one hit for sure. Like for example, 110 is one hit for sure, and you're rolling the dice for the additional 10% chance to get a second hit. This battalion though, pretty much all the figures can bear, with the exception maybe this last figure in the 22.5 degrees. So again, that's another 8-figure shot, linear target, but here we're within an inch. There's a part of the unit within an inch, so it's automatically within an inch range now. 8 figures within an inch, massed is 83, and they rolled a 25. So they're going to cause a loss on this French Légère here. Now, this is what I mean by firing into the blue. When the French fire back, he's basically got 2 targets in front of him. And they're basically the same type of target. They're both linear targets. There's not a skirmisher out here or anything of this nature, which would cause a tweaking of this. So the Frenchman's going to say firing into the blue, which means he's going to shoot his volley out here in this direction. He's going to fire the volley. And then it's going to be a random result as to where it actually lands or which unit takes the hit. Now here's the key of firing into the blue. You always take the worst possible target or target adjustments to your base firepower percentage to establish your final firepower percentage. So even though this was within an inch, and he would be firing with 9 figures, which basically is a 94%, he must use the table equivalency of firing at this unit as a penalty for firing into the blue. And this unit is not within an inch. So therefore it will be 9 figures firing at a linear target, which is 75%, if you follow the charts across. So his number to hit is 75. And he rolled an 81 and he missed. But if he had actually hit, then one of these 2 units will take the loss. It's an equal chance. There's 2 units, you get a dice, odd or even. Odd, this is the unit that took the loss. Even though he was firing the percentage at this unit, effectively their firepower is coming out at both of these units. And then it's just a question which one takes the hit. That's called firing into the blue. Now if I had a skirmisher out here, just to give you a difference, an example, the Frenchman, as from a point of view of shooting, would probably have a better shot with at least half the battalion at this unit than to fire into the blue and do his target calculations based upon the worst possible target out there, which would be this skirmisher by default. If this was a full skirmisher and he fired in the blue, this is equivalent to a 1/4 target. You look on the target modifier, firing at full skirmishers is a 1/4 effectiveness or 25% effectiveness. So if you start with a base of 100% to hit, you drop down to 25% to get the final roll to hit. So it would be much more efficient for him to fire the 5 figures, or at least half the battalion, at this unit, than fire the whole battalion into the blue, do the modifying calculation against this worst possible target. And then if he did actually do it and fire it that way, if he got a hit, then it would be odd it hits this, even it hits that, or whatever you want to, because there's 2 units in front of the possible targets. And that's an example of firing into the blue. It's a common tactic to use, especially when you got similar targets directly in front of you. Or if you're a skirmisher screen, you got a whole bunch of mass type formations in front of you. You're just firing in the blue just to get a random hit someplace. But when it comes down to formed units, how you go about doing it could make a difference. Continuing with that example we had in the last round for firing into the blue, here's another scenario or situation where firing into blue will commonly be utilized. In this particular example, we have 2 Austrian line battalions marching up, or in a position to fire upon a French deployed Légère battalion, which happens to be in a full skirmisher formation. That's at least 2 inches per figure across the frontage. Now in this example, when the Austrians fire, they can obviously hit the unit, so it's not a question for what unit they're going to be targeting. So it'll be a 9-figure firing on the long-range table, because we're more than 2 inches apart, but within 4. And that base percentage works out to be 40%. Now since the target's in open order, in this case a full skirmisher formation, the percentage is going to drop from 40 all the way down to 10, because a full skirmisher is a 1/4 target. So 1/4 of your base percentage of 40, i.e. 10%. So the Austrians would roll their dice, and if they rolled 59 here, and for the other battalion, a 47, neither of them got a hit, and therefore no effective damage was done against the French. Now when the French fire back, they're faced with a puzzlement. I've got 2 line battalions, I've got 6 figures in my front rank within 4 inches range, because skirmishers with muskets will always fire at 4 inches. They have no long or short range fire. Their fire is uniformly done on the skirmishing table automatically. So therefore their ranging is basically 0 to 4 inches. I've got 6 figures in my front rank which can bear on the Austrian blob, shall we say. Or I can elect to shoot 2, maybe 3 figures at each individual battalion. So I'd have to look at the chart and figure out which is my best thing to do. Fire 3 figures specifically at a specific target, which in this case works out to be a 15%, or fire all 6 figures at the blob. Now notice I only counted 3 figures here to fire, and I did not fire the other 3 figures. If a player elects to sharpshoot or utilize a reduced strength against an enemy target, you cannot use the remainder of the unit to fire at another target. You only throw the dice once per unit. We don't allow split fire, shall we say. You can split the unit to fire, but then you're going to have reduced fire by having the reduced number of figures firing. Otherwise, you have to use the firing into the blue method. In this case, I can fire 3 figures like I was doing earlier against the Austrian line, which works out to 15%, or I can fire 6 figures off into the blue, which works out to be 45%. Now, that 45% would have to be modified based upon the worst possible target that's out here. In this case, both the line battalions are exactly the same type of targeting. So I have a choice of doing one 15% shot with 3 figures, or one 6-figure shot into the blue against either Austrian battalion for 45%. Which would you take? I think the French will take the 45. And in this case, they rolled a 14. So consequently, we now have to determine which of these 2 Austrian units takes the loss. Odd would be this battalion, and again it's this battalion. They seem to be unlucky today. And then you go through the morale check phase to check morale after all the firepower. So skirmisher fire, when you fire, if you wish to fire only a couple of the figures, the rest of the figures cannot fire. You can't split your fire across multiple units. You can only roll 1 set of dice per unit per fire phase. Now, if there happened to be out here on this far flank, pan up the camera here a little bit, way out here, this was an Austrian skirmisher for some reason, then firing into the blue probably would not be a good selection in this case, because it would be 3 figures firing against a specific unit, i.e. the 15% chance, or 6 figures firing into the blue, but I have to then figure the worst possible target out here, counting terrain modification and or formations, or distance and ranging. And that's probably going to be this guy out here, the skirmisher. And if he was a full skirmisher, then their 45% shot would be reduced to 1/4 effectiveness for firing into the blue, which would be 11 going on 12%, something like that, which is a little bit less than 15%. So it would be better in this case to fire the 3 figures against 1 battalion and just not count any of the firing of the other 3 figures. In this case, I'd take either 3 against this battalion or 3 against this battalion and roll the dice for the 15%. So firing into the blue is good if your target is a rich environment, but if you've got poor targets out there because they're in terrain or it's a skirmisher type formation especially, or it could just be an artillery battery, which is a 1/3 target, it would probably be better in some cases to not fire into the blue and be specific in your shooting.